Living in a rural area might give someone the false belief that they and their loved ones are safe from human trafficking, but researchers have found that rural areas have fewer economic opportunities, tend to reflect people with lower incomes, and the economic hardships experienced in these communities make children vulnerable to traffickers. This is significant, being that 72% of the land in the U.S. is comprised of rural counties. Additional vulnerabilities experienced by some rural county children include rural states that do not offer comprehensive sex education, which leaves children more vulnerable to sexual predators. This lack of comprehensive sex education places children at greater risk of drug use, gang involvement, and sex trafficking. Looking at a sample of human trafficking court cases, the Global Report on Trafficking in Persons 2020 found that a majority of trafficking victims were reportedly in a condition of economic need, characterized by an inability to meet basic needs such as food, shelter, or healthcare. During the moment of need is when traffickers began to utilize deception in order to appear as a savior to the victims who were experiencing economic hardship. Within the U.S., thousands of children are trafficked every year. Youth as a group experiences a wide spectrum of vulnerability based upon a child's living situation, family, income, environment, and more. As children increasingly find themselves online and unsupervised, they are becoming increasingly vulnerable to online predators. Additionally, youth placed in foster homes are disproportionately trafficked compared to those who live with their parents or other family members. But runaways and youth without housing are especially vulnerable to trafficking. When it comes to runaways and those without housing, a study in Chicago found that 56% of women involved in prostitution were runaway youth or ran away when they were young. Runaways and youth without homes tend to not have the greatest support systems. This lack of support and unmet need for food and shelter can have minors desperate and relying on strangers in unfamiliar environments. In New York, the nonprofit Covenant House provided services to more than 3,000 youth in 2013 and found that 1 in 4 of the youth they served was either a victim of human trafficking or engaged in survival sex. Findings from this study also revealed that the number one reason youth engaged in survival sex was to acquire shelter. At 48% of those identified, we can see that almost half of survival sex was perpetuated in exchange for a place to stay. The traffickers would actively seek these vulnerable youth by loitering in the areas where kids without housing would congregate and tell them that the shelters were full, but offer them a place to stay in exchange for sex. Multiple studies show that Black Americans are disproportionately involved in sex trafficking, comprising 40 to 66% of identified victims in the U.S. Other demographics that are disproportionately affected include Native Americans, who in some states like South Dakota make up 8% of the state's population, but 40% of its sex trafficking victims. The reason these racial groups are trafficked at higher rates than others stems from their vulnerability. Looking at Native Americans, we find within the female population, they are 3.5 times more likely to be raped or sexually assaulted than other races. Rape and sexual assault are risk factors for involvement in sex trafficking. And while not all rape or sexual assault victims will go on to become sex trafficking victims, a high percentage of sex trafficking victims were sexually abused as children. This is evident as one study found almost 8 of 10 Native American women who were involved in prostitution were found to be sexually victimized as children, and half of the women involved in prostitution were in fact sex trafficking victims. Looking at environment, age, race, and the economic situation of people and groups together can show multiple vulnerabilities existing for a single individual or group. Multiple vulnerabilities create a cumulative impact that places a person or group at greater risk of being trafficked. While adding more vulnerabilities increases the risk, multiple research studies have shown that sexual abuse as a child is an extremely strong form of trauma that acts as a gateway that increases exposure to other forms of victimization, like human trafficking.